Just how good has Juraj Slafkovsky been lately? We'll be digging into his game and his resurgence in recent months in this episode, along with a whole lot more.
You are Locked On NHL Prospects, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
Hello, and welcome back to Locked On NHL Prospects, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. On this show, we break down everything prospects related for you 5 days a week, Monday through Friday. I'm your host, Sebastian High, the USHL scout over at Elite Prospects. And on today's show, we'll be digging into some young players from 3 different NHL teams. In the first segment, we'll be focusing on the Montreal Canadiens, talking about Juraj Slafkovsky, his resurging production this season, as well as his chemistry with his line mates, what we can learn from him about young power forwards across the NHL. And we'll talk a little bit about first round fits in the 2025 NHL draft for the Montreal Canadiens. Then in the second segment, we'll be looking at Collin Graf and the San Jose Sharks, breaking down his game as well as potential first-round targets for the Sharks. And finally, in the last segment of the episode, we'll be focusing on the Buffalo Sabres, highlighting Zach Benson's strong form and questioning which prospects would be good fits for Buffalo at the upper end in that first round. But before we jump into the whole show today, today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Make every moment more. Right now, new customers can get $150 in bonus bets with any winning $5 moneyline bet. That's $150 if your team wins. Visit FanDuel.com/lockedon to get started. So let's start off in the first segment with a pretty packed one here, focusing on the Montreal Canadiens and Juraj Slafkovsky. The Habs have been playing some pretty good hockey as of late. They won 5 consecutive games when coming back from the Four Nations face-off break, and after that, they did lose 3 of their following 4. So they beat the Vancouver Canucks, but dropped points to the Edmonton Oilers, the Calgary Flames, and the Seattle Kraken. So a little bit more of a choppy run here lately, but Slafkovsky has not been a factor in those losses. He even scored 2 goals in the loss against the Seattle Kraken in overtime. He's up to 6 goals and 11 points in his last 10 games, bringing his season totals to 14 goals and 40 points in 62 games. It's been a really resurging new year for Slafkovsky, quite similarly to last season, where, again, he also had a slower start to the campaign production-wise, and then as soon as, kind of December rolled around, he really kicked into a new gear and was a dominant power forward at times for the Habs. And this season, we're seeing that same thing happen yet again, where he's throwing his body around a lot more. He's getting more shots off on goal as well, using his shot as a real goal-scoring tool, and he's been playing upwards of 20 minutes on quite a few occasions here recently, getting a bit more trust from the coaching staff again, and just playing a dogged, intense forechecking game. He's been a real beast at the net front for the Habs. The one-touch playmaking ability is a real benefit, especially when playing with proven goal scorers like Cole Caulfield and Nick Suzuki. And beyond that, I think with Slafkovsky, the really big thing this season that he's been growing again is his confidence and the swagger on puck to try things and to just be fully confident in the ability of his size, his frame, his weight, to just be able to push players away. And he's been a lot more dogged in terms of his middle drives and just both on and off puck, pushing players out of his way and making space rather than trying to access it in creative ways. He is forging it. He's been very proactive as of late when I've been tuning into the Habs games, just constantly active in the offensive zone and in transition as well. He's showing a little bit more puck carrying flashes and just power and drive as a puck carrier along the wings. So a player I think is developing really nicely here for the Montreal Canadiens. And with 20 games to go and 10 points left to match his totals from last season, I think he has a pretty good chance of equaling at least the points that he put up last year. So a good year in terms of progression here for Slafkovsky. But one of the things I wanted to discuss here while bringing up the big Slovakian power forward is a more broad conversation around power forwards in general and their slower development in the National Hockey League. It's no secret that larger players take a little bit more time to catch their footing, to get comfortable in their big frame against pro competition. And we've been seeing this with a lot of young power forwards, both in terms of previous seasons who are just now breaking out, of course, like Juraj Slafkovsky, but also Adam Fantilli of the Columbus Blue Jackets, a player who's really coming into his own this season, playing with guys like Kirill Marchenko at the moment and combining for just some beautiful offensive sequences. And he's gaining a lot of confidence there. Sticking with Columbus, Cayden Lindstrom's another power forward I think should be given a lot of patience, especially because he's missed his entire D+1 campaign so far, missed a decent chunk of his draft year last season as well, with different injuries, mainly been back and shoulder injuries, I believe, with Lindstrom. But he's another player I think that with some patience could develop into a really, really creative but powerful and gritty and violent kind of NHL player, a bit like Juraj Slafkovsky's been doing recently, but doing so potentially while playing center for the Blue Jackets longer term. And he's certainly not a player I'd be giving up on anytime soon if I were a Columbus Blue Jackets fan. So a player that I think is very exciting and brings a lot of potential offensive upside. And along the same vein, also battling injuries this season is Roger McQueen, a 2025 draft eligible talent who played the first 8 games of the season in the WHL and was dominant, and then missed so much time, only coming back very recently from that injury, playing with the Brandon Wheat Kings there in the WHL. But he's played 5 games now since coming back in the new year, and he's scored 4 assists across that span. So still taking a little bit of time to get his feet underneath him. And in his first game back against the Red Deer Rebels, he did log a whopping 17 penalty minutes without any points on the board. But overall, he's a player that I also think has a bunch of upside that, with Juraj Slafkovsky's development trend in terms of it taking time to be able to consistently implement the physicality with the other creative elements in his game, of being able to layer physicality through the playmaking with feet in motion, doing so at high paces through contact. These are all different levels that take time to build up and build through as a young power forward. And I think that Roger McQueen also has the power, but also the soft skill and the creativity and the dynamism to become a tantalizing power forward at the NHL level, either as a right winger or down the middle as a center. I think either of those are possibilities for his development. But to return a little bit to the conversation with the Montreal Canadiens, I did want to wrap up this segment by focusing a little bit on who the Habs could be targeting here on draft day, because there are a lot of different options, especially where the Habs are going to be picking in all likelihood, which is in that 12 to 20 range for both their own selection as well as that of the Calgary Flames, who are being elevated into a playoff spot by Dustin Wolf at the moment. So those 2 picks currently on Tankathon are slotted at 15th and 18th overall. So we're going to be running with that. But one thing I wanted to note before we talk about candidates in that range is the possibility of trading up at the draft, because I think the Montreal Canadiens would be very interested in moving up for a player by the name of Caleb Desnoyers, a homegrown Quebecois 2-way center who plays with physicality, very intelligent, high-end playmaker. A lot of things in his game that remind me a little bit of Nick Suzuki. I think he'd be a very complimentary player to have down the lineup, to be able to interchange wingers between those 2 lines of 2 centers who could play very reliable 2-way games, but also bring some offensive flash and a high level of intelligence to the game. So trading up for him could be very interesting for the Montreal Canadiens, maybe in that 6th overall range, maybe 8th overall as well. But if he's available in that stretch, I would definitely imagine the Habs would be interested in moving up. But if they do not, in that 15th or 18th overall ranges, a couple players I think they could be interested in. Carter Bear at 15th overall, a player who just had an awful season-ending injury that is going to impact his draft stock. Lacerated Achilles, just cut with a skate, and it is a really ugly injury. But he was able to walk off the ice somehow with that injury, which I think is a clear sign of just how dogged of a competitor this kid is. He's the hardest working player in this draft class, probably alongside LJ Mooney, in terms of work rate, incessant motor, just constantly overwhelming opposition with violent energy, really, is the gist of it. And he brings also a level of playmaking dynamism to that. Been one of the better scorers across the entire WHL this season with the Everett Silvertips, really leading the charge offensively for that team in many capacities. So a player I think the Montreal Canadiens would love in terms of identity to build around. He can play at center, he can play on the wing, would be a great like inheritor of the Brendan Gallagher role for the Habs in a top six capacity. Just as an absolute spark plug, who will bring more playmaking than goal scoring, which is, of course, different than Brendan Gallagher. But some other targets in that range: Brady Martin, a big two-way center out of the OHL and the Sioux Greyhounds. I think maybe a right shot defenseman or a center could fall into that 15th overall range. If a guy like Logan Hensler is available, I think the Habs would really jump on a player like that. Same could be said about maybe like Malcolm Spence could be interesting. And moving on to that 18th overall range, Malcolm Spence and Justin Carbonneau, I think, are really interesting because Carbonneau brings a bunch of dynamism and skill and power from the wing, a bunch of offensive upside, which the Habs will want to continuously mine in their organization, whereas Malcolm Spence would be more of a solidifying middle six, face-off winning, high energy kind of player who can play on the wing or down the middle, very versatile, very adaptable. Or they could go for a right shot defenseman. And in that capacity, the name that stands out in my book would be Blake Fiddler of the Edmonton Oil Kings in the WHL. A player with excellent skating, a fantastic rush defender, 6'4", 209 pounds as a right shot defenseman. And he's a July 9th, 07 birthday, so very young for this draft class. And he's a dominant puck carrier as well off the rush. So he's dominant both at stopping transition and in jumping up in transition to help his team move the puck out of the defensive zone and into the offensive zone. But the actual offensive generation in the offensive zone has been a bit more limited this season. So a player that does his best work on puck, in motion, at speed, in open ice situations, as a puck carrier off the rush, but also a very good passer in those situations. A player I think that would really complement what the Habs have building on their defensive core and would slot in as a top 4 right shot defenseman potentially longer term. But that wraps up this first segment on the Montreal Canadiens. In the next one, we'll be focusing on the San Jose Sharks and Collin Graf, who has been fantastic recently, having scored 2 goals in a 20-minute performance against the Chicago Blackhawks recently. All that and more coming up after these messages from our sponsors. If you're like me, your mornings have to start with a good cup of coffee. But I got tired of settling for grocery store brands that just weren't cutting it. That's why I turned to Trade, and let me tell you, this coffee is next level. Trade is the #1 specialty coffee marketplace in the United States, bringing you fresh coffee from over 50 of the country's top roasters. Their experts have taste tested thousands of coffees, curating over 450 amazing roasts. Whether you're new to coffee or know exactly what you like, they'll handpick the perfect match for you. I took their quick quiz, and in just under a minute, they matched me with the roast that was fresh, smelled incredible, and tasted even better. Right now, Trade is exclusively offering our listeners 40% off your first order at drinktrade.com/lockedonnhl. That's drinktrade.com/lockedonnhl for 40% off your first order. March Madness is here, and FanDuel is giving you the chance to get in on the action like never before. Right now, new customers can get $200 in bonus bets when your first $5 bet wins. That's 200 extra bucks to use on anything from buzzer beaters to Cinderella stories and even who's cutting down the nets. I've got my eye on a few underdogs this year, and FanDuel makes it easy to back them with spreads, totals, and game props. With tournament games happening almost every single day, there's always something exciting to bet on. The FanDuel app is simple to use, and when I win, I get paid instantly. No waiting around. So visit FanDuel.com and get in on the college hoops action all tournament long. All right, let's keep this episode rolling in the second segment, focusing in on the San Jose Sharks and Collin Graf, who's been a fantastic player for this team over recent weeks. I've been loving what I've seen in my viewings of the Sharks with Graf's speed and playmaking ability off the rush. He's such an incisive attacker in transition, constantly trying to make defenders miss, make them bite to the outside before cutting back inside, really challenging players and challenging defenders in one-on-one situations, which I think the Sharks could really use more of beyond just Celebrini and maybe Eklund as well. There's a bit of a limitation in those qualities in their lineup. Even Will Smith is a bit more of a methodical kind of off-puck attacker than to take defenders on one-on-one and just blow right past them. But Graf brings that element to the game, and I think that opens up the ice in many ways for the San Jose Sharks, which I've been really liking to see so far this season. In 23 games with San Jose, he's scored 4 goals and 9 points. And with the Barracuda in the AHL, he had 8 goals and 32 points in 35 games before being called up. But he's now a regular, playing middle six to even top line minutes, depending on the night. He has varied between 10 minutes and 20 minutes over the last 10 game sample. So playing a little bit everywhere in the lineup, plugging in here and there. But when he's on the ice and has space to work with and a little bit of runway to build up speed, he is such an incisive attacker. And I think that that's been a great element for the San Jose Sharks. And he's scored 3 goals and 6 points in his last 10 games. So 6 of his 9 points have come in the last 10 of his 23 games. So he's picking up speed. He's playing more minutes. He's getting more comfortable with the puck on his stick in the offensive zone. I've been seeing him be a bit more creative with his handling in recent games. And I also think that he's a player that combines very nicely with the likes of Tyler Toffoli in terms of his speed, opening up a lot of possibilities for Toffoli's very methodical, cerebral off-puck play, and very clearly lacking speed, being the one thing in his game that is very, very obviously below NHL average. But Tyler Toffoli has all the compensatory tools and habits to still be a fantastic NHL player. And I think that playing alongside the young guns now coming up and through in San Jose is very, very good, because Toffoli is a great player to shepherd a younger generation along in this sense. And Collin Graf has been an important part of this. But I'd be very curious to hear from you Sharks fans in the comments below. What have your thoughts been on Collin Graf? Where do you think he could settle in your lineup longer term? Do you see him as a third line guy or maybe even a second liner potential long term? But with so much skill coming through the ranks still and more draft picks on the horizon, where is he going to settle at the end of the day? Because of course you have players like Quentin Musty, Kasper Halttunen, and so on and so forth still coming through the ranks and not being in the AHL just yet. But I'd be curious to hear from you in the comments down below. But to wrap up this second segment, let's talk a little bit about the draft possibilities here for the San Jose Sharks, because it's a big draft for this team. Yet again, currently they are holding the number 1 lottery odds on Tankathon. They are currently the worst team in the entire NHL. And if they get that first overall pick, I think Matthew Schaefer solidifies this lineup in so many different ways. He would bring a focal point and a just anchor on the blue line for the next 2 decades for the Sharks in terms of a franchise level defenseman who can do everything at both ends of the ice and would be there to compete with the other elite defensemen league wide towards the end of the playoffs. If the Sharks do end up going on those longer runs in the next couple of years, I think that he'd be a fantastic fit in San Jose and would allow Sam Dickinson to either play that number 2 role on the top pairing, or playing as a number 3 defenseman on a second pairing and logging big minutes against lesser opposition. That could also be very, very interesting. But if Schaefer isn't the player in the end, if they don't pick first overall, if he's no longer available, or if they want to go for a forward instead, I think either of Michael Misa and Porter Martone would be very, very good fits here as well. Misa would bring a basically second solidifying franchise center to the equation, and having 2 of those pieces to build around is a rare luxury. So that would be very interesting. And when in need, they could of course always also roll a line with both Celebrini and Misa on the ice. But if they opt for the big power forward instead, and whether Martone is a power forward or not is, of course, a bit of a debate still at this stage, because he's mainly a soft skill playmaker with a pretty hard shot as well at this point than a real power forward with how he uses his frame and his weight. He can chase violent hits, sure, but he's not the most effective in tight, small details physical player as of yet. But he has that runway to grow into that kind of player, and he'd bring a very different element to the game than the Sharks have at this point in their depth chart. I think that that would make a very interesting kind of top six where you could have a player like Martone on the top line with Celebrini and Eklund, for instance, leaving players like Smith, Musty, and Chernishaw, for instance, on a second line. I think that is tantalizing and has a lot of balance as well in both skill and intelligence and versatility and profiles throughout that top six. But I'd love to hear from you in the comments down below which player you think the Sharks should be targeting in the first round this NHL draft. But that wraps up this second segment. In the final one, we'll be discussing Zach Benson and the Buffalo Sabres. But first, a quick message from our sponsors. Ever check your bank account and wonder, where did all my money go? Between dining out, online shopping, and entertainment, it's easy to lose track. That's where Monarch Money comes in, your personal CFO giving you full visibility and control over your finances. Monarch Money isn't just a budgeting app, it's a complete financial command center. You can track all of your accounts, investments, and spending in one place so you can stop managing your money and start building wealth. When I started using Monarch, I realized just how much I was spending on food delivery. Now I budget smarter and can save even more. Take control of your finances with Monarch Money. Use code LOCKEDONNHL at monarchmoney.com for 50% off your first year. That's monarchmoney.com, code LOCKEDONNHL for half off your first year. All right, let's wrap up the show here in the final segment, fixating on the Buffalo Sabres and Zach Benson. The Sabres have had a tough go this season. They are bottom of the Atlantic, one of the worst teams in the entire Eastern Conference, and very clearly in the running for a top 3 draft selection at this point in time. And I think that's something that this team has needed. They've needed another top 3 draft pick in recent seasons. It just hasn't quite been enough with what they've had in their lineup in terms of taking that next step. But with so much youth throughout the lineup that are going to be taking those next steps in the next year or two, there is real promise building here in Buffalo. The first playoff qualification in over a decade is going to be on the horizon here, Sabres fans. I promise you. I know it's been a long time coming, but there is so much talent in this organization, which you've been hearing for years, but I think that with a top 3 pick this year, you're going to see this team take a step in the coming 3-ish years. Zach Benson is far from the only young player in this roster. Of course, you have players like Jack Quinn, JJ Peterka, Yuri Kulik in here as well. And on the blue line, I mean, Owen Power is still a 2002 birthday as well. So a lot of youth still on this blue line and in this overall lineup, but players that are going to be taking steps in their development. And Zach Benson's one I wanted to highlight because whenever I watch him play, I'm reminded of why I fell in love with him as a prospect in his draft year. I had him ranked 4th or 5th overall there in the 2023 NHL draft, and he was available at 13th overall for the Sabres. But Benson's been playing some fantastic hockey with a bunch of intensity off puck, making quick reads, being first on pucks very, very often because he anticipates play faster than most NHLers can, even though he still is just a 19-year-old player. He's turning 20 in May. And overall, I think that while he hasn't quite taken the step as a top 6 consistent producer just yet for the Sabres this season, I think that that step's coming next campaign. The pace, the intelligence, the skill, it's all here with this player. The way he plays the game, the consistency of engagement, the refined habits off puck at both ends of the ice. There's so much to work with, and I think that he's going to be a checking and playmaking play driver for the Buffalo Sabres for years to come, and just one of the more fun players in the NHL to watch play hockey. I think that young players who are watching the NHL for inspiration of how to mold their games, Zach Benson's a player that I would encourage them to look at and learn from in terms of the engagement, the reading, the scanning habits, just constantly moving and looking and adapting, and at a breakneck pace, never relenting. And I think that Benson is built for the modern NHL for those reasons and will be taking an offensive step, hopefully, next season. But to look more specifically at the Buffalo Sabres and their drafting possibilities this season, I don't think they need Matthew Schaefer as much as other teams that are going to be drafting high. Of course, they already have other first overall selections on the blue line, Owen Power and Rasmus Dahlin, of course. But Michael Misa, I think, would be the perfect player for this team. He's exactly what they lack in terms of high-end intelligence, combination of goal scoring, playmaking, play driving ability, do it all two-way center who projects as a top 15 center league wide at the peak of his career. It's a profile that Buffalo has just lacked ever since trading away Jack Eichel. And I think that Michael Misa would be landing perfectly in Buffalo. He's intelligent. He brings enough physicality, I think, to also play the way that Buffalo, as they're currently building their team, want to play the game of hockey, which James Higgins, I don't think would be as good of a fit. But I think that with Michael Misa, a player like Zach Benson could also absolutely explode, a player that could read the game at his pace and also plays in terms of interchanges and fluid switches in the offensive zone, a similar brand of offensive hockey. So Michael Misa would be a great fit, but I'd be very curious to hear who else you think would fit with the Buffalo Sabres, whether you think that Matthew Schaefer is indeed the best fit here, or maybe a guy like Porter Martone or James Higgins. I'd be very curious to hear from you Buffalo Sabres fans down below, but that wraps things up here for us today. Thank you so much for tuning in. As always, if you're listening on your favorite podcasting platform, please do make sure to make us your first listen of the day. We always appreciate our everydayers here on the pod. For your second listen of the day, you're going to head on over to Locked On Fantasy Hockey, where Flip and Steel break down everything you need to know to build yourself a sustainable and competitive fantasy roster. And if you're watching on YouTube, please do leave us a comment, like, subscribe. Thank you so much for tuning in. As always, I'm your host, Sebastian High, and I hope to catch you listening again very, very shortly.